Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show. I'm Andrea Macdonald, the founder of ideaXme. ideaXme is a global network, a podcast available in 40 countries worldwide, a creator series and mentor program. Our mission is to share knowledge of the future. Today's episode, we're going to talk about AI in health. AI is the new technology revolution. I'm here with Tom Lawry, National Director for Artificial Intelligence, Health and Life Sciences, Microsoft USA.
First of all, thanks for having me. You've got a great production and it's great to be back. So in my role as National Director for Artificial Intelligence for Health and Life Science at Microsoft, essentially I have the privilege of working with some of the top provider organizations, health payers, and life science companies around the world as a strategic advisor to essentially help them look at the work they're doing, how they might do it differently, how they might do it better with the introduction and use of artificial intelligence.
You recently wrote a book about AI in health. Could you talk a little bit about that book?
Yes, thank you. So it's a book that was published last year that focuses on AI in health, but it's not a book about technology. It's really a book about how AI can, in fact, be used to change the way healthcare works, the way big organizations like hospitals work, the way physicians practice, down to and including the ways in which AI can help drive a much more intelligent health system and experience for health consumers today.
As I mentioned, we have a broad audience of creators and pioneers and scientists who shape our world, students, university students who would like to do so in the future. But we also have a huge number of listeners amongst the public. Could you paint a picture of AI as well as the AI technology systems that feed into the process? For example, machine learning, NLP, neural networks, so that people get an idea of what is involved.
Absolutely. We're using a lot of big words there. And so, yeah, the thing about artificial intelligence is it's a highly complex system of technologies. But when you strip it down, it essentially is a number of things that can be understood and applied to make healthcare better. So you talked about things like machine learning. Machine learning is nothing more than the ability for us to use technology to predict things. So let's look at something in healthcare. And oftentimes when I'm working with clinicians and others, one of the exercises we go through is to simply say, if there were three things you could predict to make what you do better, what would they be? So things like machine learning give us the ability to predict things at a higher level than what the individual physician or clinician can do. Things like natural language processing that you mentioned, or NLP, is simply the ability of artificial intelligence to look through massive amounts of information to look for trends, clues, themes. So for example, when COVID first hit, there were thousands of articles on the COVID family of viruses, and yet none of those had been brought together for researchers to use. We used natural language processing to bring together 40,000 research studies and articles literally in a matter of days to make that searchable and make it available to groups like frontline physicians in public health or the early stages of drug development. So these are all tools that have some complexity, but when you strip it down, it's helping us do things to make humans better at something they care about.
Can you talk to us about the chronology of AI? It was first spoken about in the 1950s. Can you talk to us a little bit about the progress of AI and the associated technologies?
Absolutely. Well, I'm not only kind of geeky on AI, I love history. So technically, we have references to AI going back to the 1600s, believe it or not. But really, artificial intelligence started really coming into the world in the mid-century of the 1950s. There were a number of things that were being done to advance the cause of machines basically mimicking more functions that are normally the purview of humans and the human brain. So a number of things have been around since the 1950s. What's happened just in the last decade, though, is the introduction of the cloud, uh, great progress being made by moving data from those big computers stored somewhere in the basement into places like the cloud. We've seen, for example, one of the benchmarks for advancements in artificial intelligence is what's known as human parity, which is getting something that a computer can do to the point where it equals what a human is capable of. So just in the last few years, and Microsoft has led the way in many of these things, we've reached human parity on things like vision, speech, knowledge extraction, and a host of other things where a computer is as good as an average human. Why that's important is that there are many things we could do, say, a decade ago in the lab that were experimental, but these were things that would be hard to replicate and take out into the world and have it be repeatable in kind of industrial strength. So we've reached that point where many of these functions that previously could be done are now industrial strength, built into the components of many IT systems that allow organizations to start working with things like conversational AI, or a much greater ability to make predictions on things like cancer treatments, drug development, and just a host of things that have come up in the world just in the last few years because of our technology advances.
Now, the cloud is the engine room of AI. Can you explain why that is so important and the relationship between the cloud and data storage?
Yeah, well, that alone would take at least one more episode. But, in a nutshell, I mean, think about, again, the evolution of computers, whether it's those big systems that historically resided somewhere in the basement of a big company, or the advent of that personal computer that as a consumer, the first one you bought, and now down to and including, the capabilities of that thing that's either in your purse, your pocket, or on the desk right now, which is your smartphone. So much of that, the applications and the data behind it have the ability now, because of the cloud, to basically be fluid. So before, data you might have on your personal computer, the big company you work for and their big data systems, they had their own computers. It was kind of like all that data was kept behind the garden wall, that they were, tethered to those systems, and it was extremely difficult for data to move or be aggregated. The cloud gives us the ability to make it very fluid, to bring multiple types of data together in a very agile fashion, to start doing really interesting, creative things in the use of that data to hopefully do good in things like healthcare. So the cloud really did create that openness. And then along with that, as everyone knows, comes the importance of things like privacy and security standards. But that really has been one of the major breakthroughs, particularly in the last decade, that's opened the door to so many of the things we're seeing progress today.
Could you explain briefly to the audience what the cloud is? Because the cloud isn't in the clouds, it's a series of network systems, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, sooner or later, well, the simple definition I would offer is simply, you have these massive, server farms that are all interconnected, through this relatively open network, though there are different forms of the cloud. And essentially, the data you put there can reside virtually anywhere in this series of data farms. A lot of it goes back to, again, historically, the 1950s and the creation of these worldwide computer networks to safeguard against major parts of the world going down in the ability to transfer data. But essentially, it's server farms around the world somewhere, all interconnected with these universal protocols and standards that allow anyone to put information in, take it out, in keeping with a growing set of security and privacy standards to make sure that is at least as safe and reliable, probably more so than the computer that you may be storing data in today.
In your book, you talk of protecting your data, managing your data as if it was your most precious asset. In reading a number of articles that were looking to the future of AI, since having read your book, many talk of the increased data regulations coming on board. Could you talk about those and how big organizations need to ready themselves for the new laws and regulations coming?
Well, I guess a couple of things on that, Andrea. I mean, one, it's interesting to me where I hear many healthcare leaders talk about how data is the new currency in healthcare. And if that's the case, I always like to pose the question, if data is the new currency in healthcare, are you managing your data the same way you manage your finances? And the answer is usually not as much. But the second part would be just to say, I truly see data as an amazing asset that can be applied to do good in the world, not just in healthcare. So if we look at healthcare today, for example, and the amount of time it takes for medical knowledge to double. So in 1950, a newly minted physician would go their entire practice before medical knowledge doubled, so 50 years. According to one study, as of last year, medical knowledge is doubling every 73 days. So think about that. You're a newly minted, top trained physician, and we just graduated today, knowing a couple of months from now, there'll be twice the amount of medical knowledge to deal with. So it's a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity to be saying all of this knowledge, if sorted, if leveraged, can be applied to do much better all those things we care about when it comes to health and medicine. So with that in mind, it's incumbent upon healthcare organizations to really look at how they're managing, how they're provisioning all the data they have, knowing that it's doubling at a very rapid rate. So they can even let it languish, or they can take advantage of that to do good. Now, with that comes a host of key issues, and that's where many times the technology, in this case AI, often gets out ahead of the guardrails legislators and regulators eventually put on it. So today, in most parts of the world, there are things like in America, there's data regs. In Europe, there are things like GDPR that govern all data, not just healthcare. But beyond that, it's important to look at how we use these things in a way that's not only safe in compliance with current regs and legal restrictions, but we also take that one step farther to look at how we're applying all of that data in general, or your specific information as a patient, in a way that is responsible and ethical. And that's an area where it's a very hot topic. And there are a number of things that we're championing when it comes to going beyond just what's legal and being in keeping with all the regulations of your country.
When you go through, looking 10 years ahead from now, I mean, AI already is impacting pretty much all areas of our lives, from business right the way through to health, sport, entertainment, you name it. AI is involved somewhere down the line. Comparing how things are today, how do you predict, let's say, using 3 different categories, AI changing those categories? For example, sorry, putting you a little bit on the spot here, sport. And maybe another example, I'm a sports person, I'm a scientist, or I'm a politician. Those 3 different scenarios as a comparison to today, how they're impacting me today in those 3 positions, and how AI will impact me in those positions in 10 years.
Yeah. Okay, I'm parsing that question, Andrea. So let's start with the consumer. I want you to think about today, no matter where your listener is, how the world has become much more intelligent thanks to things like the cloud, the internet, all those apps on your smartphone today. Most people, and again, I mentioned it earlier, I'd be willing to bet anyone listening to this, your smartphone's either in your purse, your pocket, or on the desk or tabletop in the coffee shop that you're listening to this. So, You have it close because you use it to do all kinds of things to make your life easier and better, professionally, personally. And so as that happens, what's interesting to me today is there's a shortfall, in my view, of all of those things you manage with those smart applications. Then when it comes to turning to the health system, many times there's a lag between what you're doing with everything else with those smart applications and what you can do in healthcare today. So moving forward, there's the rise of what I call the intelligent health consumer, which is, increasingly, and I think COVID brought this around and put a finer point on it, is consumers are waking up to the fact that the health system doesn't have to be the way it is. It can be much more personalized. It can be much more directed by those consumers who want to play a bigger role in their own health. So going forward, the use of artificial intelligence, much of which, think about any app you have on your smartphone, it's smart because behind that is some component of artificial intelligence. So as we move forward, you're going to see a lot more being driven by smart companies doing things to say, how do we make that process of seeking, achieving care better? And then taking that one step farther in the next 10 years of really looking at how we apply those things to keep you healthier in the first place, to reduce the need to actually be turning up at that NHS facility or wherever you are for service, because those very smart systems have helped keep you and your family healthier over time. Beyond that, I guess the second part would be when you look at how that affects, say, a physician or clinicians. We know today, for example, worldwide, especially here in the United States, physician burnout is a huge issue. In America, the studies show that up to 40% of all physicians are at a point where they're showing one of several signs of burnout, which it doesn't help them. It certainly doesn't help if you're the patient of a physician who's burning out. So increasingly, the value of AI is not to replace these great knowledge workers, but to help augment the work they do. There was one study by Accenture that showed that up to a third of all activities of a physician can be automated with artificial intelligence, which are the highly repetitive activities that, if we can automate, give them more time to do things like actually talk to the patient, or even things like more time for research, or something as simple as they could actually get home and see their family for dinner a little more often. So those are just a couple of examples, and all of that to me, and the secondary theme of my book is how artificial intelligence is leading to the emergence of what I call intelligent health systems, which are entities that leverage data and AI to create strategic advantages through the provision of health and medical services. But the key operative thing is they're going to do so across all touch points, experiences, and channels. It's not just a use case or two to point to AI. It's truly for those who are moving towards intelligent health systems. They're going to revolutionize that experience for the consumer and for the physicians as well.
So AI is going to be fantastic for cost cutting. It's going to improve workflows. It's going to improve diagnostics. It's going to, on so many different levels, make your average person's life easier, freeing up more leisure time. Could you talk to us about some of the risks?
Well, I mean, you paint a very glowing picture. Much of that, in some form or fashion, is already beginning to occur. But part of the earlier conversation we just had around legislation, regulations, with everything comes risk. And that's where the creation of things like what I call guardrails to really create a way of channeling to do good and to mitigate the risks of doing harm is critically important. So in that regard, and at Microsoft, we've been champions of this for a number of years. We call that responsible AI. There are certain things that are incumbent upon everyone to not only understand, but to work towards making sure we are mindful of and have standards that mitigate the potential for harm being done. So a classic example would be, what we call bias in artificial intelligence. So maybe a quick example. So everyone listening, you're now commissioned as the leadership team of the top hospital in your region. And we've decided to use artificial intelligence to reduce what's known as adverse events. So we put patients in the hospital today, and as they go through that course of treatment, there'll be a few that randomly have some event that we didn't expect. Their heart stops, they stop breathing. We call our code team in, we get them stabilized, and then we ship them off to ICU instead of sending them home. So we're going to use AI to try and predict which one of those patients are going to have a high risk of adverse event. We've done that using AI. We did a pilot, and we were able to reduce adverse events in the pilot patients by 40%. So from a quality perspective, that's a great win. From a cost perspective, if I've kept you out of ICU, that's a win. But 40% is a statistical average. So while it's good, if I told you that 40% was based on our ability to predict and prevent adverse events at a rate that's 3 times greater for white males versus Hispanic females. I've still improved quality, I've improved cost, it's legal, but is that okay? And these are the issues that we must be mindful of and work towards mitigating. In this case, bias is simply a matter of, I've got an algorithm that's making accurate predictions, but it's much more accurate, meaning there's higher variance in my ability to predict by race, by gender, by any of a number of classes, where I can correlate things, but it comes down to then that factor of what is right and what is wrong. And you know, I can't tell you what that is, but these are the issues that as AI becomes more pervasive, everyone from the clinicians to the consumers should be mindful of. There are other things around what we call AI principles, but right now, bias is one of the hot topics simply because we're seeing predictive capabilities being introduced. And there are times where that stress testing for things like bias has not been done to the level that it should be.
Could you also talk to us about the situations in which in your book, you provide some examples of when AI gets it wrong, and clearly, you know, the human factor, wisdom, empathy was missing?
Well, yeah, there are many of those, unfortunately. You know, there are also many, just to balance that out. There are far more examples where it's doing good, and you know, it's not biased, and it really is producing overall good. But this is where we have to be mindful of not rushing ahead just because we create what we call correlational value. So, you know, probably one of the better known examples, particularly in the consumer press in the last couple of years, was a really great smartphone application where you as a consumer could take an image of, say, a skin lesion, and it would be able to calculate whether that was, you know, the likelihood of that being cancerous. And so it was another case example of it worked really well if you were a light-skinned person, but it didn't work so well if you were a darker skinned person. And, you know, there are things like that. There are things where, again, I'm trying not to geek out on you, but for
No,
example,
please do. We have a lot of geeks in our audience.
So one of the biggest things for everyone to recognize when we look at things like machine learning gives us the ability to predict things in healthcare. And what's important to recognize is just because you can predict something doesn't mean it's right. This is an example of in the world of data science and the world of ethics, it's something known as correlation versus causation. So let's say I brought data together and I'm using some AI. I can correlate two things as somehow being highly likely. So correlating something doesn't mean causation. And I've got examples I use in some of my workshops where, you know, I can have a high correlational value between things like cheese consumption and the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. There's almost a perfect correlation. But if you look at that, any reasonable person would say, well, that doesn't really correlate. I mean, cause, if you eat too much cheese, you don't die because you're tangled in your bedsheet. So this is where it's understanding what computers and AI are good at, what like variance analysis, pattern recognition, and also recognizing what it's not good at that humans are great at and always will be. Things like reasoning, judgment, common sense. No one has figured out how to teach computers any of that, which is why it's that marriage when it comes to healthcare of having predictive capabilities that are looked at and managed by that well-trained, experienced clinician to be able to say, this is aiding me in a decision, or, well, that's not right. I know, given my experience, given all these other things, this is the way I need to go. But many times people who don't really understand those differences, they don't get it right. And those are the people who typically talk about how AI is going to replace physicians or other things that anyone who really recognizes the value, the capabilities of AI, understand is that marriage of putting those things in and behind knowledge workers, be they physicians, nurses, finance specialists, but anyone as a knowledge worker armed with these tools and they're in control, that's how we drive value. And that's not just in healthcare, that's in anything you might want to do with artificial intelligence.
Can I just take you back to another one of the issues to watch out for? You mentioned it in your book, where the FDA have a new set of challenges as the machine learns. It effectively changes the offering, as it were. It's a sort of a movable thing. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, and how have things moved forward since then?
Yeah, and it's a simple example, but it also speaks to the complexity of not only the capabilities, but what we need to look at how we manage. So in the world of AI and machine learning and predictive capabilities, there are things known as continuous learning algorithms, which is to say, we set it up to predict something. Let's say we set it up to predict who might be at risk of having a stroke using some medical device that is a self-worn device. So that algorithm may start by predicting using a certain pattern, but with each case, with each patient, with the more data it gets, it keeps learning, just like a human does when you, say, take a class. The more you learn, the more you read, the more you study, the more you learn, and the way it changes the way you think. Continuous learning algorithm does that the same. So when you look at the way in which things like the Food and Drug Administration license and certify that something's safe for consumer use in a medical situation, having something that continuously changes absolutely blows up the model that groups like FDA have used in the past, because they like to have everything lined up and certify and test and say, okay, it's good to go this way. But the moment you throw the on switch on with the continuous learning algorithm, it's changing the way that algorithm works and arrives at that predictive conclusion. So that produces great good, but it also produces the risk that somehow, if that does go sideways or off track, it needs to be monitored. There needs to be the ability to kind of stop and back up the tape to be able to say, how is this making a decision? Is it making a decision that's consistently good and in the interest of why we certified this? Is it producing good unevenly back to that bias issue? So it's a great opportunity, and everyone's still trying to work on how do we manage that so it is fair, it is safe, and it is consistent.
Again, putting you on the spot, if I may, if you were invited in to be the head of AI at one of, I'm talking from London, let's say one of the top hospitals in London, St. Thomas's Hospital, for argument's sake, what do you do on your first day? What are your priorities?
Well, again, I think there are many great examples, by the way, of what's happening with AI applied to health and medicine coming out of the UK and London and some of the great organizations. Before I was in the role I'm in, I was director of worldwide health. So I spent a lot of time working with a lot of great organizations in the UK and Europe. So for me, and it's back to the book, the thing about AI is it's become what I call a shiny object where everyone loves to talk about it and, how it's going to create a bright future. That only happens if leaders understand what it is, how to apply it, which is a lot of leadership, what I call the leadership imperative. It's imperative to understand what it is and what it isn't. It's imperative to be bringing your clinicians and others along in that journey from the beginning. And that's everything from looking at how over time that will change the way clinicians practice to having what I call the when AI meets HR conversation, because as time moves on, there are some jobs, frankly, that will be automated out of existence. Most jobs in healthcare, though, will be augmented, meaning the way in which you do that job is going to change, which means a different skill set, perhaps different training, perhaps in the future, looking at the type of person you recruit to come into healthcare. And that's before you even talk about all those other things on how to make all of that growing data better, more what we call interoperable, to be able to, with agility, make better predictions, do better services that really serve the needs of all those consumers that those organizations are there and chartered to be the best at.
Talking again to the geeks in the audience, I count myself as one of them. I'm interested in everything. Could you talk to us a little more of the types of technologies and trends that the geeks amongst the public should look out for? For example, data whisperers, quantum physics.
You have read my book, thank you. So data whisperers, that's I think that's a term we've made up for my book. But so we look at things like today where we have all this data in healthcare, but it could be any industry. If whatever industry you're in, think about all the data you have and how, if there were no boundaries to that data, you could bring it together, all the things you would be doing differently and be better at. So in healthcare, there's a massive amount of data, typically anywhere in the world. The data's there, but it's typically stuck in silos. So you've got your electronic medical records, you've got your patient administration systems, labs. So you got the data, they're all in silos. And then the process today of doing any analytics, and especially AI, is we pull the data out, we put it somewhere, and we stage it and do all these cool things. Eventually, we get to make predictions. And there's a lot of studies that show when you're doing analytics, 80% of all effort is just getting ready to do the analysis. So imagine a time where it's not only that, or it's much easier, but we have the ability to, instead of going out and doing all of that, of having tools with artificial intelligence, doing that automatically, and it's bringing us information. So your term of data whisperer is simply one that a good colleague of mine, who's the chief science officer for Microsoft, did a project a while back where he applied AI to search engine queries, and it was just going out to a search engine, not looking for healthcare, but just looking at patterns for anyone putting their hands on the keyboard, doing a search with the search engine. And long story short, he was able to identify a group of internet users that had pancreatic cancer before they had a diagnosis. And many people stopped and go, what? But the concept is simply large amounts of data are whispering things to us all the time. We either don't have the tools to hear it, or we're not paying attention. So imagine all the data, back to the UK, all the data that NHS has today. What are the secrets? What are the things that if all of a sudden we knew what that data was telling us, might allow us to get out ahead of either an individual's patient medical condition or health, or equally important, of getting out ahead of a population of patients, all the diabetics in the UK, and our ability to say, we know things now that this data has within it, and we have the ability to proactively not only understand it, but get out ahead and use it to do something positive.
Tom Lawry, before I let you go, can we talk about rich connectedness? I'm fascinated to know with whom you've connected during the course of your life. who has helped you move your human story forward. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and name some names?
Oh my goodness. Well, on that, it's always interesting because, like many others, my journey has not been linear. And I guess early on, I've always talked about how, and I consider it a great quality, I've never known what I'm not capable of doing. So when I get an idea, I just start pursuing it. And I've been blessed with, mentors and others who have helped me along the way, even when I had an idea and I was clearly not qualified. So, I mean, that starts early in my career. I spent 12 years as a hospital executive. I had great mentors who basically took a 24-year-old person and within a year, I was on the management team of a 500-bed hospital in the United States. After a successful career in healthcare, knowing very little about IT, .com era hit, and I left a perfectly good career to start a web-based company, and we did very well. But along the way, it's people who believed in you, whether it's senior hospital administrators, whether it was VCs that saw the idea. Today, the biggest part of what I do as an advisor is I get to impart knowledge, but more so when I parachute into these organizations trying to solve big problems, I'm always learning far more from others who are the clinical leaders and others that I'm probably imparting. But so it's everything from, like, right now, one of the coolest things that I'm invited into is I'll name a name. Anna Sawyer is a physician. She's on the School of Medicine at University of California, San Francisco. She's also the head of their space medicine program and an advisor to NASA and SpaceX. And so I'm fascinated by, people talk about, telemedicine. Aner and others are working on things like medical systems that will operate in deep space as we try and send someone to Mars. So being invited in to work with people like Aner and all those smart people taking on, probably the biggest telemedicine project I can imagine of asynchronous systems between here and Mars. There's so many opportunities in the world to get excited about. And for me, it's data and AI and how you take that to make the world better. For anyone else, it's like, what is it that gets you excited? And for me, anything I get excited about, I have passion for, I move in that direction, and somehow, God opens the right doors, and it's been a great ride.
Tom Lawry, Head of AI in Health at Microsoft USA. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Andrea. Great to be with you and great to be back. You have a great program.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us on this episode of the ideaXme show. ideaXme is a global network. We're on all the major podcasting networks. You can find us at www.radioideaxme.com. You can find us on YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe.